Hello from Washington. I'm Shihoko Goto, Director of the Wilson Center's Indo-Pacific Program. I'm excited to be able to host a conversation today about the evolution of Japan's international presence over the past decade. There have, of course, been a great deal of changes in the regional order over the past 10 years. We no longer talk about a rise of China. Instead, we focus on how to manage relations with China. There is bipartisan support across the United States to address China as a systemic strategic competitor. But countries across Asia and beyond, including Japan, focus on managing relations not just with China, but also with the United States. Over the past decade, there have been great expectations for Japan to be a regional as well as a global stabilizer amid heightened tensions. Japan has, of course, come up with this vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which has become the foundation for a regional strategy adopted not just by Japan, but also by the United States, the EU, and individual European countries. To discuss this and more, I am excited to be able to introduce the authors of a recently released book entitled Japan's Rise as a Regional and Global Power, 2013 to 2023, A Momentous Decade. This is edited by Gilbert Rossman and Brad Glosserman. Gil is a very familiar face for those of us at the Wilson Center. He is the Emeritus Musgrave Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and also Editor-in-Chief of the Asan Forum. Joining him is Brad Glosserman, who is the Deputy Director of and Visiting Professor at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University and Senior Advisor at the Pacific Forum in Honolulu. So with that, let me first turn to you, Gil. The title, in a way, says it all. It is a momentous decade for Japan's leadership, both in the region and the world. If you could talk to us a little bit about the significance of why you chose this particular decade and how Japan has come across, how Japan's vision of the region has become a defining strategy, not just for Japan, but for the world at large.
Shioko, thank you. And I'm delighted to help introduce this book with Brad and you. The book really derives from the writings that began in 2013. I was asked to edit the Asan Forum, and I decided that one of the important themes to introduce would be a country report for each of 4 countries, China, Japan, South Korea, and Russia, drawing on sources in the languages of those countries every 2 months, rotating the 4 introduction country reports 6 times a year, each report, and to say what is being said about the policies within Asia, the thinking, the debates toward foreign policy in Asia in each of those countries. So that led a few years ago to the idea that, wow, we have all this information, what should we do with this? At the same time, I was also inviting authors to write papers, usually coordinated in what was called a special forum. So there'd be 4 papers or 3 papers working together to discuss a particular theme. And a lot of those papers were very relevant for examining the evolution of foreign policy. So, and then I was asked to organize panels for the Korean Economic Institute, where about 15 authors were invited each year to present papers. And again, those were organized around themes. And there were so many interesting papers year by year. Could we bring them all together and trace the evolution of policy, trying to explain what happened, why it happened, how it happened? And so the first book that came out from this was Vladimir Putin's Turn to the East, which began in 2012. So this was an examination of a decade and how he was trying to change Russia's policy in Asia. The second book that came out was South Korea's Wild Ride. 3 South Korean presidents and how they tried to change foreign policy over this decade. So this is the third book. And I was delighted that we could bring it together, and it came out in this summer. The fourth book has already been submitted for publication. It is Xi Jinping's quest for a Sinocentric Asia. And it, like all the other 3, draws on Chinese sources year by year to trace what happened in thinking about Asia. I consider Northeast Asia the fulcrum, extending through the Indo-Pacific, but where 4 countries are trying to transform the way Asia is organized and the US role in Asia. And there is such good material that's not being used in the language of these countries. So when I look at the Japanese newspapers, and we draw on all 6 major Japanese newspapers and several major Japanese journals, as well as scattered articles from other journals, and I say, what can we learn? How much of this is actually being translated and used in the wider literature? And not very much is. And so by tracing it, by delving deeply into it, I thought we could really come up with a new way of thinking about how Japan has evolved over this decade. And that's how this project has developed.
So let's talk a little bit about how it's evolved. Why do we start at this year? What happens? What are some of the highlights that happen that actually lead to this change? And change not just within Japan and the Japanese leadership and expectations for power projection of Japan, but also across the region and beyond, about what role Japan can play.
Well, I think 2012-13 is really the starting point for a major transformation. And the driving figure in much of this is Xi Jinping. So he comes to power at the end of 2012. And then Abe comes to power at the end of 2012. And Kim Jong-un is just consolidating power at that time. And then we have a shift in the Korean leadership in early 2013 with Park Geun-hye. So leadership change is huge, but I think a lot of it has to do with the realization that the economic dynamism of Asia is a means to an end, and that countries are really concerned about what to do beyond economic cooperation. They're thinking about their geostrategic concerns. They're thinking about national identity interest. And so it's really that turning point. And Abe is recognized as a turning point in Japan. He has a clear vision of what he wants to accomplish, although there are ups and downs and changes that mean that we have to look at different periods of Abe's leadership and then post-Abe. But basically, I think it's a transformation across the region, and it means that the US has to change too. Although the US is not generally driving this, it's responding a lot. And everybody's then following up and saying, what is the US doing and what we can do in response? So I think this is the key here, that there's no decade quite like this one in the post-Cold War era or during the Cold War era, where things were pretty stagnant. And then there's no region like this one, and there's no place where you can get such interesting information, where there's so many publications that tell you the thinking behind all of that, rather than just concentrating on official policy, examining the debates, the interpretations. And so that is the driving force behind this.
No, that's very interesting, your point, especially about economic dynamism and it no longer being a means to an end in itself. What's also interesting about this decade is that despite Japan's political presence and its leadership on the international stage, Japan's economic foundation, the Japanese government may argue otherwise, but it hasn't been that robust. What we have seen instead is this huge increase in Japan's presence and also expectations for that as well. Let me turn to Brad. So the book is divided into uh, a key number of chapters, but one chapter that you are responsible for is to talk about Japan and its relations with Europe. Gil has already given us some overview of some of the changes that have happened in the region in terms of leadership. What happens with Japan reaching out to Europe? What kind of change is there in the nature of the relationship between Japan and Europe? And what motivated that?
Um, a great question. Let me, if you don't mind, sorry, but I want to go back to read to Gil's comment about the changes of that. And I think that he's absolutely spot on. But I would add one other wrinkle, which I think is important, particularly in the context within which we framed this about the notion of economics as a mean to another end. And that is let's not forget the global financial crisis. And I think that what that did was it really shook, I think, the pillars of global order and the nature of expectations about American management of a global economy, acceleration of Chinese beliefs that the future was theirs. And I think that all that as well is a cornerstone of what is evolving that we're tracing. And I just think that it's important to remember. I mean, none of this, of course, occurs in isolation. None of the developments that Gil goes into with the remarkable depth and concision. But I think it occurs to me that particularly within this economic context, the GFC becomes a really, really key moment in history and shaping thinking in Beijing and Washington and in elsewhere, because it just really went in so many ways to the heart of as while he's right to say that the United States was that at the same time it was, if you will, a key actor in sort of, if you will, creating this larger context within which history unfolds. Now, with that by way of avoiding your question, let's go to Europe. And in the book, I contribute 3 chapters, 2 of which are upon Europe. One is on Japan's security relationship with Europe, and the second is on Japan's economic relationship with Europe. And I think in the short version for both, to start with the security piece, is the continuing belief in, and while there has long been a separation of spheres from the European to the Asian theater, there has nevertheless always been something of an insistence by the Japanese that security is indivisible. And we heard this in the 1980s with the Intermediate Range Forces Agreement, when there was concerns that the Europeans or the Russians were going to pull their weapons and the missiles out of Europe, move them behind the Urals where they would become a threat to Europe and into Asia. And at that point, the Japanese were very concerned that they were seen as an afterthought. And that's where you began this claim that security was indivisible, that you couldn't segregate and separate the theaters in a meaningful way. And clearly, I think that's what's happened over time is the reality of that indivisibility has become clearer, and certainly after Ukraine. But essentially what you've sort of, particularly in Europe, I think the Japanese have looked at Europe as a vehicle by which they could primarily use as a diplomatic platform, a way that they could bring their thinking about security into a larger community and to a wider audience. And I think that we've seen in particular with the evolution of thinking in NATO about China. What you've seen, of course, is the articulation of China and the recognition that China is a systemic threat, which isn't to say it's a direct military threat, but the recognition that there are other levels of security and that there is a shared view among the transatlantic nations and Japan, and certainly I think even among the Indo-Pacific Four, which now includes New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea, that there needs to be a similar approach and assessment and response to the rise of China, one that views it as essentially a revisionist power and one that poses very real challenges. And I think you've seen, that's gained traction to no small part because the Japanese have been pressing that, and of course Washington has too. And so the chapter traces, if you will, the evolution of the relationship between Japan and NATO, and then of course Japan and its particular defense relationships with individual countries, in particular the UK, which has long been a key partner for Tokyo, of Germany, France, Italy, and some of the smaller states as well. And so, without going into too much detail, I think the key element here is to see a convergence in increasing European presence within this part of the world, certainly in the last few years, and tighter bureaucratic links, administrative links, such as the reciprocal access agreement with the UK, that is also is a consolidation of those security ties. And so I think we're seeing that movement, that trajectory is continuing. Japan's participation in the global combat fighter project with the British and the Italians, I think, is another sign both of diversification of security views or partnerships, as well as just, I think, a shared understanding and recognition of the broad security environment. So that's chapter one. Chapter two looks at the economic relationship and essentially what has happened with the EU. And I mean, there's the remarkable piece of that, of course, is the way at which first Japan was seen so much as a threat, right? A nuisance. And some of the most insulting comments about Japan's economic policies have been made by European leaders at one time or another, whether it was Charles de Gaulle or I'm sorry, I'm jet lagged. The prime minister, the subsequent later French prime minister, who referred to them as just a nation of ants back in the 90s. I'm sorry, I'm tired. But the degree to which what was seen as primarily an intensely competitive relationship and a considerable amount of disdain for Japanese companies has instead evolved toward this great partnership. And I think that what's really key, and to cut a lot of this argument short and to move on to other issues, is the degree to which the Europeans and the Japanese really are extremely like-minded in the notion of promoting a rules-based order, and that they are quite natural partners in working together to promote institutions and values and norms, and frankly, in ways that we would have expected the United States to be involved in, and has proven to be, in the last several years, something of a disappointment. And so, and related to that, of course, is the fact that concordance of views between Tokyo and Brussels and individual European capitals has also, I think, in some ways blunting the sharper edges of American economic aggressiveness in the multilateral sphere. And so I think the key feature that I would take away from my chapter, to be as reductionist as possible, is this idea that the Europeans and the Japanese are very like-minded in their approach to international economic order and are working together in ways that we shouldn't be surprising, but in fact are.
Kyoko, let me step in by giving a little bit of the Asian parallel, how Japan has changed towards Asia now that we've talked towards Europe. And I see this as a momentous decade, because if you compare what Japan's foreign policy was like prior to Abe and what it's like today, it's like night and day. So on issues like security, collective security and defense policy, Japan was passive then, and now it's fully involved and engaged. Or you take human rights, Japan was quiet, not willing to speak out on sensitive issues because of its priority on relations, keeping a good relationship with China or even Russia for a time. And now that's changed dramatically. Or you take economic issues, the shift from economic regionalism to economic security has been far-reaching. You can go on to talk about how fundamental the transformation of Japan has been. And in this book, It's really, in what I've written, there are really four chronological segments to this transformation. There's Abe 1, which coincides pretty much with the Obama era. And then Abe is still thinking a good deal about history and combining some elements of revisionist thinking with some realist thinking about a new posture of Japan in security. And so there's a little bit of up and down, and things look pretty difficult in 2014. Troubled relation with South Korea, differences with the United States on Russia, big differences after the Crimean War. The Yasukuni Shrine after effects, and so on. The U.S. trying to create a more multilateral framework in Asia, and Japan not working consistently with the U.S., and Japan somewhat nervous about Obama's policy towards China not being adequate. So that was a period of rapid change, generally very good US-Japan relations, but there were ups and downs, and things changed dramatically in 2015 when Abe comes to the United States, speaks before Congress, comes up with his historical statement on August 15th, has a breakthrough with South Korea. So this is period one. Period two, we see Abe dealing with Trump and dealing with Asia in the context of Trump, coming up with his own initiatives for the free and open Indo-Pacific, but also doing things quite differently from the US, wooing Putin, talking about a honeymoon relationship with Russia when that's not at all US policy, although Trump may disagree on some of that. There was also the Belt and Road Initiative cooperation under Nikai. So Japan was operating in Asia differently, maybe somewhat hesitant about just sticking with what the uncertainty of Trump's policies were. And of course, Japan felt isolated during Trump's diplomacy with North Korea. So this was another period of ups and downs, but generally pretty good Japanese-US relations. And then we get to the post-Abe era, and Biden is now taking the initiative. He's developing minilateralism and a strong emphasis on the relationship with Japan. Japan is kind of the gateway to Asia. And Japan is going along, but not quite sure how far along. And then the Ukraine war comes. We can come back to that later. But Japan's policies towards India are shifting. Its policies towards Korea are shifting. So the whole regional context shifts over this period, over these several periods. And I think that the big transformation points are 2015 and then 2022, 2023, where Japan makes fundamental changes to become a more normal country. And at the second period, or second Abe period, Abe period is not quite a normal country. The period from 2022 is. It's fully engaged, and I think the sort of the symbol of its leadership intentions is the Hiroshima G7 summit. That is a big deal, but it's not entirely just follow the US. There's something independent in what Japan is trying to achieve. And we have to recognize this sort of tension between a very closely improving relationship with the US and some desire for autonomy. Japan has its own identity and own purposes in Asia as well.
You know, if I may, two quick comments. The first, of course, on that last point is Shoko's, is your chapter in the book, I think, sort of goes to this, the centrality of Southeast Asia. But, you know, it's fascinating to me that 20 years ago-ish, we were all having debates about Japan as a normal country and would Japan become normal, and whether or not, whatever you thought of it, the point was that we were using that phrase with regularity. And now, even and as this evolution has occurred, I could not tell you the last time I ever saw that anywhere, even as a, you know, as a marker of where is Japan now a normal country. It was just that when the degree to which it so dominated the discussion of any potential changes, that when the changes occurred, suddenly that phrase has vanished. And I don't know what that means, Gil, but if you got thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Well, normal country essentially means two things. One, joining with the United States in managing the world and the Indo-Pacific. And two, Japan that has a voice to speak out for its own interest and identity. And so to the extent that Japan feels it has joined, there was no more need to talk about normal country, right? It's already there. And it's not just the United States anymore. It's a whole group of countries in Asia, including Australia, and it's Europe as well. So that is a dramatic change. But in terms of normal with its own voice, I think there's still a little bit of uncertainty. What is Japan's voice? Where can it express that? And I agree with you that Shioko's theme of Southeast Asia is critical. Japan considers itself a bridge to the global South. And Southeast Asia, as well as India, are sort of the entry points for the global South. Japan has to be able to be special, different, to say the United States doesn't quite understand these areas. It needs Japan to play a bridging role. And I think that's where normal is still a little bit up in the air.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing concerted efforts on the part of the Japanese government and the leadership to really hone in on this idea of Japan as the bridge builder. It is at the crux of bridging this divide between East and West, North and South, industrialized versus middle income and below countries as well. So we're also seeing an ambitious Japan, which is saying that its success in the free and open Indo-Pacific vision can actually be expanded beyond the scope of Asia, that there is an opportunity for like-minded countries to come together in some of their shared interests and shared values as well. And I believe that when the United States is step back a little from this, but when we talk about shared values, there is greater comfort, especially in countries like Southeast Asia, which focuses less on governance per se, but instead focusing on the rule of law, and focusing on predictability and stability, rather than things like democracy or human rights, which kind of contradicts what Gil said earlier, because Japan is stepping up in those realms, but at the same time, it doesn't, that it's not necessarily its priority. I want to segue now into Ukraine. We touched on this very briefly, I think, but when we talk about the pivotal moments in Japan over the last decade, how Japan has dealt with the developments in Ukraine compares very sharply with how it dealt with Russia regarding Crimea. We see a difference between how Abe has dealt with Putin compared to Kishida, and its personal relations, and also Japan's broader objective and end game when it comes to managing relations with Russia as well. I'm wondering if either of you, but I'm looking especially at you, Gil, on whether you might be able to shed light on this.
I think this is a really interesting development, but I don't think it's just because of the Ukraine war. So if you go back a year or two before the war, there was already a sense of discomfort with Japan's Russia policy. If you look at the Japanese press And already the right and the left were not happy with Abe's policy for several years. It was rare, but Yomiuri was sticking very strongly as the sort of the right center with the policy towards Russia. But by the early 20s, it was sensed that it was dead. The initiative to recover the northern territories, the initiative to keep diplomacy going with Putin wasn't going anywhere. And the Russians were already very disappointed with Suga, that he wasn't following up on Abe's policy. So already there was some big change going on. Another change was the policy towards China. There had been talk in 2019, 2020, into 2021 that Xi Jinping was going to make a state visit to Japan, and it was going to be a big deal for Japan-China relations, that Japan had a distinct relationship to China, unlike the US. And the media sort of ganged up on the government and said, why are you talking about a visit from China? Look what China's doing. We can't have this visit. Cancel the visit. Stop talking about it. And so this backlash was visible early. And then Biden comes around and he says, we have a policy which demands very close cooperation with Japan. And so in 2021, he has a whole slew of initiatives which say we're building on what our relationship with Japan, and we're listening to Japan. And I think that all precedes the Ukraine crisis. So when Russia goes full scale into Ukraine in February 2022, and Kishida is experienced in foreign policy and has an understanding of what's going on, Japan comes down full scale with the United States, abandons its already shaky Russia policy, and comes forward by saying, hey, Europe, hey, United States, this is not just about Ukraine, this is about Taiwan. And a Ukraine contingency today is a Taiwan contingency tomorrow. And so that normalizes things, gives Japan a bigger voice. And then at the Hiroshima G7, Japan thinks it can have a special leadership role, because now it's bringing in leaders from other Asian countries. And it feels that it has a special relationship with Modi, and and the United States is listening to Japan. And even though Japan may be following Biden very closely, it wants to say, hey, we have our own approach. We're doing something different. And the global South becomes a symbol of that. Unfortunately, Modi doesn't cooperate. He deals with Putin differently, and he doesn't fully embrace Japan's role or the United States' role, even though we have the Quad, which builds up very significantly. So Japan's effort, and with Southeast Asia as well, as you can speak to, Shioko, these hopes for Southeast Asia become more difficult. Philippines, wonderful. They're doing what Japan wants, and Japan feels it's got this triangle now with the United States and Philippines. But there aren't many others. Putin visits Vietnam. Independent Myanmar policy doesn't go very far, and so on. So I think it's a groundbreaking change with the Ukraine war, but it's not just because of the Ukraine war. Forces are already moving in that direction, and I think it's Abe's legacy, but it has to be changed. Abe has more emphasis on autonomy and independence of the U.S. Kishida doesn't carry that forward very much, but rhetorically, there's still that theme. And I don't know how much longer it can be raised, but of course, a lot depends on US politics too.
If I can add just two sort of corollaries that just kind of, I think, slide under Gil's analysis because they're at best supplemental. The first would be, I think one of the differences that Japan, or that one of the factors that shaped the Japanese response to Ukraine was the European response. And I think we've all forgotten pretty much in 2014, the Europeans didn't do much. And so that, if you will, if they were prepared to let Putin give him a free pass, I saw particularly when Abe has his own agenda with Putin, there's no reason to be any more hardline than the Europeans are in that particular crisis. So I think that's factor number one. Factor number two goes to the G7 itself, which has for so long struggled and which, to my mind, looked pretty close to irrelevant until, frankly, the Hiroshima summit. And I think Kishida was masterful in terms of giving that somewhat moribund organization a new life. And I think he did a service to all the rest of the G7 members by once again making the organization relevant. And remember from every G20 meeting and every other previous whatever international gathering for the last several years, when they tried to put something together meaningful on Ukraine, the best we got was a real hedge. And so the forward-leaning statement that Kishida was able to produce at the G7, and mind you, that's because precisely the makeup of the membership. I think what we see this is that too mattered, the rejuvenation and the resuscitation of that particular institution. And it'll be interesting to see as it evolves whether or not that is seen historically as just a real pivotal moment as it becomes perhaps a G10 or some people talk about a D12 or some such, but something more, and that proves to be the moment that gave it a new life.
Yeah, definitely. So as we look towards the next G7 summit, which will be hosted in Canada, there's already speculation and excitement or frustration about who will be the plus countries beyond the G7. So in this particular case, in Italy, Korea, for instance, was not part of it. It was invited, though, to the Hiroshima summit. It is expected to go to Canada. How do we include countries like Korea or Australia, and indeed the global South as well? It is one of the other issues that I wanted to raise was about Abe's vision for Taiwan and leaning into saying that a Taiwan contingency is a contingency for Japan, that Japan does need to come into the defense of Taiwan, even though how exactly Japan is actually going to come to the assistance of Taiwan is still being debated. And that, I believe, is one of the biggest issues that Abe post-office has been able to articulate. We are now going through the election process of finding a new leader for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. At the end of September, Prime Minister Kishida will be succeeded by another member of the party. We can speculate on who that may or may not be. But my question is this: to what extent does leadership matter for Japan? To what extent do personalities matter when Japan is engaging with world leaders and trying to enhance its presence, to enhance its vision of saying that although Japan does follow to a great deal the leadership that is demonstrated by the United States, Japan has its own priorities and its own focus areas.
You want me to start, Brad? Okay, I'll start, but I'm sure that you will have much more to say about Japan's leadership aspects. I think we're at a point where things are rather baked in. I don't see a turning point where a different leader in Japan is going to stop talking about a Taiwan contingency. Fear in Japan about what will happen over a Chinese coercive move on Taiwan is palpable. They just can't imagine a situation where China controls Taiwan and the South China Sea and much of the East China Sea, and Japan is isolated geographically. So I think that turning point is clear. It's come because of Xi Jinping's policies, frightening Japan. It's come because the United States has stood up and shown leadership on Japan, which is more and more obvious. And it's come because Ukraine was a wake-up call. And the understanding that war is no longer a rarity. It can happen again. So I think that the leadership transition is likely to bring someone who has a great deal of continuity on foreign policy, beginning with China, North Korea, South China Sea, the three crises that Japan feels are in its own neighborhood with which it has to deal, and that it must act. And as long as the United States shows leadership, Japan wants the United States committed, is fearful of US abandonment. As long as the US is showing leadership, Japan will keep joining and prodding the US to do even more than it may be doing. So I think that's where things are heading right now.
If I may, to start with the Abe and Taiwan situation, I mean, this is truly a classic case, as the academics would say, of moving the Overton window, because Abe said after he left office what everyone had been saying privately, and the degree to which within the security circles there was an acknowledgement that Taiwan's role and position was crucial to its own national security and national interests, that it had to be prepared for a crisis or a contingency. And the question merely was, what would that role be? And there was no appetite whatsoever for any of that conversation to be had in the public. And it's a testimony to, I think, the shift in the external environment, which I will come back to in a minute, and to Abe's determination to move this discussion and to bring, frankly, to make it a public discussion and shift the context and force, if you will, politicians to become engaged in ways that they would not had it not been exposed as he had. So I think that's really key. But in the larger context of the Japanese foreign policy and its momentum, I mean, without Gil's absolutely right, of course, the momentum is set. I don't see another leader being able to somehow change the direction, as we say, to play with the metaphor, to shear the ship of state in another direction. I mean, there's an interesting question to be asked: how much of that has Kishida been a beneficiary of as well? And the only thing I would ask as a counterfactual is, for all the credit that he's received, could he have not done most of the things that he had done? And that really, whether it was sort of ordained, but that's a discussion for a different critique of our book. But I think what's going to be interesting, and I was just in San Diego this weekend discussing this with some Japan scholars, is that the direction is set, but the hard choices have not been made. And quite simply, they've decided to double the budget, and won't talk the defense budget. We're not going to talk about the particular accounting games that went into that. But importantly, the fact is that there are hard choices that are going to have to be made about how, in fact, the money's paid for, and how Japan likes to reconcile. I always like to say it's not guns versus butter in Japan; it's guns versus wheelchairs are the policy choices. But in fact, with the emphasis now on childcare, it's guns versus wheelchairs versus strollers. And there's no indication to me that certainly anyone in the government is prepared to say, these are the priorities in this order, and this is how we're going to pay for it. And so, which brings me then to, I think, the really key question for the election for Japan is there a politician that genuinely has a vision? And we know that Taro Kono and, say, Shinjiro Koizumi are said to be reformers and innovators, if you will. Excuse me. But do they genuinely have a vision, which is one of the things that Abe really had, was a vision for the country that melded national resources with national interests and the ability to move the bureaucracy in ways that would effectuate it. And then finally, third, most significantly, which Gil mentioned earlier, Abe proved to be far more pragmatic than anybody ever thought. And he was capable of tacking when he was defeated in 1 minute to change direction, to rebuild political capital, and then move forward again. But nevertheless, that ability to back off was something A, that no one expected him to have, and B, he'd never demonstrated in his first term in office in 6 and 7. So the question I have is there a Japanese political leader not only with the vision to meld all of that stuff together, but does he or she have the political capital to make the hard choices? And, in so many ways, again, we alluded to this earlier, the external environment is set, and it's going to remain somewhat menacing for the foreseeable future. And I think there's an understanding in Japan that they have, among the Japanese, that they have to and have needed to do more to prepare for that and to get their policies in line and national security policies in ways that better protect the country. But what there hasn't been is the commensurate addressing of economic interests and concerns in ways that create the resources to do just that. What Abenomics and Abe did and with Abenomics was create confidence, but I think in retrospect, most people, and I think as you said, Shoko, it was a failure, right? It wasn't the success that it was touted to be. And similarly, I think you've seen a failure with Kishida's New Capitalism, and that there hasn't been the creation of the economic infrastructure that is going to sustain and create an enduring economic confidence that will be essential to this larger vision and role in the world. Sorry, I rabbited on that, and I hope that was coherent, but trying to just tie those threads together.
I will add one thing. I think we're in the era where less focus is being given to military security and much more to economic security. And that means a coordinated policy of managing the different aspects of economic security. Japan, with its secrecy law, with its new economic security minister, and a whole host of other things, is entering that era pretty quickly. But a lot is still ahead of us. The response to Ukraine and the new policies just this week towards China and Chinese companies that are supporting Russia, just an indication of where we're heading in the next stage of managing this challenging economic issue.
Absolutely. And just to pile on to that, and I know our time's running short, this is a topic about which I've been working for a number of years, and the ability, I mean, the Japanese, you talk to most governments and they'll tell you the Japanese are looked at as really leading the way on the economic security agenda, doing precisely what Gil identified with the economic security promotion law and with the creation of the minister and the reorganization of the National Security Secretariat. On the other hand, there's also a real danger that this could easily turn itself into protectionism, techno-nationalism 2.0. And there has to be a concerted effort. It shouldn't be hard, but nevertheless, that inclination has got to be countered. And the degree to which we are able to effectively reconcile the genuine security dimensions of economic policy with economic policy, basically understanding how to price security, seems at this point to really be beyond the ken of just about anybody, particularly the economists I talk to.
Yeah, and this focus on the security dimension of economic policy is certainly something that Japan has taken a leadership role in. The US officials do look to Japan to see how they are legislating on this issue. But at the same time, this is the cooperation and coordination on economic security is a must, but it actually leads to a limited amount of countries being at the heart of it. So as we talk about a G7 of political and foreign policy leadership, there is a different grouping when it comes to industrial coordination. So we already see that with export controls in the semiconductor manufacturing front. So with that, we see Japan working together with the United States as well as the Netherlands. Should South Korea and Taiwan be included in the broader semiconductor technology protection mechanisms, right? We've already seen the Chip 4 alliance staggering because there is competition, especially between Korea and Taiwan over the same industrial niche. But can we actually do more cooperation and coordination on other sectors within the semiconductor industry and beyond as well? I also want to point out that economic security traditionally is not about technology protection. It really is about food security, energy security, social welfare as well. This goes back in to some extent about Kishida's new capitalism idea, which as a concept is not did not really capture the public imagination. But there are nuggets that perhaps a new Japanese administration can kind of put forward and use as a vehicle to unite or actually attract more cooperation from the global South. And one other thing that I want to say is that as the count down the remaining days of the Kishida administration, his victory lap is focused on foreign policy. So his last hurrah will be in New York before the UN General Assembly. His crowning achievements have been things like enhanced relations between Japan and the United States as well as Korea. That trilateral reaching out to Europe, reaching out to the global South and the like. The challenge, of course, will be how Japan is going to not just afford its own defense vision, but also its ambitions to work more closely and be a champion for the global South as well. We are quickly running out of time, so before we wrap up, I did want to say thank you to you both, Brad and Gil, for your time. Congratulations on the new book. Thank you very much for allowing me to contribute a chapter to it on Southeast Asia. We are all looking forward to your 4th volume in the series. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.